Candice, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast. We've known each other for a long time, and I'm happy you've accepted the invitation to be here. For those who don't know you, you're an immigration specialist.
Yes.
You founded a company called Coral Bridge.
Yes.
And maybe you can tell us a bit more about that and since when you're in Mauritius and what you do.
Thanks so much, Bill, and thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat about something that I'm very passionate about. I think I've said that to you. So basically, I've been in Mauritius for about 19 years now.
Wow.
Small 1-year gap in the middle. Around about 2010, my husband and I went back to South Africa for a year, but came back and my daughter was born here. So yeah, a very long time. And I've pivoted a lot during that time. Around about the COVID period is when I got into immigration. Many people couldn't leave at the time, but I sat on numerous Zoom and Teams calls with people who were dreaming about a different place and getting out of lockdown. So that was actually really interesting and kind of pivoted into that role from then. I was actually asked by a management company at that time to come in to an immigration role with them because they were looking for somebody who had been an expat on the island for a really long time and could bring not just obviously the administrative side to the role, but also just assist with all the other questions and answering the myriad of queries that people relocating have. So that's sort of how I ended up where I am now. And since February last year, I've stepped out on my own and set up my own consultancy firm.
Well done. So what exactly do you do as an immigration specialist? Just for people who are wondering what do you do? How do you help expats in their administrative process to come here?
So obviously it's all the administrative side. So dealing with the permit applications themselves, I kind of hold the person's hand through the process. What I've found is that I think it's one of the top 5 most stressful things you can go through in life when you move countries. So you can imagine families, they're moving, whether it's for a job that they already have or a role, or maybe they're retiring, maybe they're looking to set up on their own, and they're moving their family, they're moving their children, they're moving their dogs or their cats, they're selling their house, they're selling their car in the country they're coming from. So there's a lot of moving parts, shipping your household goods, deciding what to bring, not to bring. So there's a lot of stress, a lot of moving parts involved. And what I do is I try to obviously answer lots and lots of questions and guide them. I put them in touch with various people. I've had clients that are not able to be here themselves, and I've actually done house viewings with real estate agents for them, sort of on video, give them a checklist of what aspects meet their requirements, what aspects don't. So that's sort of, I don't do that for all the clients, only the ones who really need that. But really try and hold their hand as much as I can through the process. And in that, take one of the biggest stresses off their plate, which is just getting the paperwork and the legislative stuff right. So that at least when they come here, maybe they've had hiccups with some of their shipping, or their cats haven't had the right vaccines, or there's a bit of a delay, but at least then they know, okay, well, my permit's sorted. And that's one thing. So I think it takes a huge pressure off. So essentially that's what I do, but it's, like I said, there's so many questions and so many aspects to the consultancy side of it that it can be quite varied.
Candice, as you know, this podcast is about communication in the business environment. And in every episode, we'll look at a specific theme. And the theme of this episode is same language, different meanings. How things get translated, get lost sometimes in translation, and just how communication sometimes goes wrong, even if we're both speaking the same language. And you gave a TED talk not very long ago. If I remember, it's about a year or two ago.
Maybe, I think around about 2022.
Yes.
Maybe. I can't even remember.
Well, I've listened to it a couple of times before this podcast, and you speak about how poor communication can ruin your business. And you touch a lot on cross-cultural differences, even when we're speaking the same language. And I think it'll be interesting to talk a bit about that during our conversation today. Just before we start recording, we were just exchanging funny stories of phrases that we hear in Mauritius and that you only hear in Mauritius in English, and maybe expats or non-Mauritians don't really know of them, and it also works the other way around when Mauritians don't understand some expressions that are so typical elsewhere. Could you maybe tell us, have you ever had a moment when something you said was completely missed by the other person, although you were both speaking in English?
Yeah. So look, I think there are quite a few. I'll probably steal the one example from the TEDx talk that I did. I had a few years back, I had a client from the USA, and obviously both first language English speakers, and we were sitting in the taxi, and he had I had obviously put him in touch with the bank for his personal bank account opening, and I was trying to see how that was going. So I said to him, very South African, I think, expression. I said to him, "Did you come right with the bank?" And he kind of looked at me blankly and said, "Pardon?" He said, "I don't understand what you mean." And something for me that was I didn't even think twice about that phrase. I've said it all my life. Did you come right? Meaning, did everything go okay? Did you have success at the bank? He just didn't understand it. It was one of those moments, those aha moments that you have where I suddenly thought, maybe I need to be a little bit more careful about how I speak to people, because you're assuming someone's a first language English speaker and they totally understand you. But he's obviously from a country on the opposite side of the world, and it was a totally foreign phrase to him. So I think it does come out often because it's habit. But every time I'm wanting to say that now, I catch myself thinking, wait a minute, who you're talking to. And I think that's what's really important is know your audience.
Absolutely.
Who are you speaking to? Where are they from? And just bearing that, sort of keeping that in the back of your mind while you're having a conversation. And I think especially when it's, when you're talking about sort of paperwork and things that it's not just a casual conversation, but you need to make sure that the person understands what you're saying so that you can get things right. So,
and in terms of phrases that Mauritians say, are there any? I know you've mentioned to me there are a few that you, as a native speaker, as a non-Mauritian, you find a bit difficult to understand at first. But since you've been here for a while, you get what they mean.
I think there definitely are. I've kind of gotten to the stage where sometimes I use those phrases myself. At first, I thought this is such a strange thing to say, but you realize as you adapt to your environment, you actually start using them yourself because you know that the person you're speaking to is going to totally understand what you're asking. So there are a couple. I think the one that pops into my mind is Mauritians often tend to say, can you do the needful? Which basically means, can you do as requested, or can you do what needs to be done? And at first, when I heard it, was very strange. I'd never heard this phrase before, and I didn't quite understand it, but obviously staying here for a while, you soon realize it's a very common thing to say. But I did hear a story once where somebody said that they wrote that to a client in America over email, and their client in America came back and said, actually, when we use that phrase, we refer to that as when if somebody's going to the bathroom, and so the client was a little bit confused, and that's just, I think, something that's totally lost in translation. And it's a bit of a humorous example, but I think what it goes to show, it's just knowing your audience.
Exactly.
I can totally, with confidence, say that when I'm speaking to anybody in the Mauritian environment, especially native Mauritians, they will absolutely understand what I'm saying. But when it comes to speaking to somebody who's from another country, then I need to be very careful with what I'm saying.
That's interesting you say that, because to native Mauritians, we wouldn't think twice about that expression and what it means, because it's so much part of everyday correspondence. And let me give you an example of a term that you would only use in Mauritius in the legal world. And it's, as you say, it's not always grammatically correct. This one is completely grammatically incorrect, but it's a term that has made its way in our legislation, in judgments of the Supreme Court, and basically every lawyer in Mauritius uses it. If I tell you this application needs to be filed within the statutory delay of 14 days, what do you understand by that?
A statutory delay. It sounds almost like it's negating itself.
Absolutely.
But yeah, that it obviously needs to be filed within the 14 days.
That's
I would
right.
assume what it means, but it almost sounds like you have to file it after 14 days.
Yes.
I would assume, I think for safety, I'd probably just do it early. But
You're absolutely correct. So the word délai in French means time frame. And
okay.
I don't know if it's with time that this term has developed from a délai, from the French délai to become delay in English, which has obviously a completely different meaning in English. Delay means lateness.
Exactly.
And but the term statutory delay is now used in our legislation, in judgments of the court, in arguments made by lawyers before the court. And what we mean by that is the limitation period provided in the legislation. And it reminds me, every time I work with foreign lawyers, or as you know, maybe our ultimate court of appeal is the Privy Council. And when we have cases before the Privy Council and there's that term used in the legislation that we're referring to, we always have to have a footnote there.
Yeah, I would assume so, because anybody from another country is not going to have a clue what you mean.
Let me tell you about my courtroom story for this episode, because as I said, every episode is kind of centered around a courtroom story. And I had an arbitration case a few years ago. It's ongoing. And my client was an Indian businessman, very sophisticated businessman, very successful, very fluent in English. The arbitrator is South African, and the other party is from another nationality. So we chose an arbitrator who's neutral in terms of nationality. So on the day of course, in an arbitration, we've got a strict timetable to file several documents. One of the documents are the written arguments of the parties. That's what we call written submissions. And I'm UK trained, and I draft my submissions in the manner that I've been taught, which is very concise, precise. Less is more. Sometimes, avoid any flowery language. Avoid all the
straight
fluff.
To the point.
Exactly, all the fluff, all this superfluous words. And I sent my draft submissions to my client. I usually send a draft just for them to have an idea of what's going to happen. I don't expect them to give me any feedback on the legal position, but if there's anything that they think could be addressed to make them more comfortable, that's something I expect them to send back to me. But when they sent me, when they sent the document back to me, it was in track changes mode, and with a lot of additions in terms of the style, in terms of the expressions used. And I just noted some of them, and I'll give you a few examples. One of them was, I can't put it in context because of the confidentiality of the case, but basically their point was, look, the other side's argument is baseless. And that's something that I have no problem to say. I would say as the submission of the other side is without any merit, or has no foundation in law, as simple as that. But they wanted me to say it's an egregious breach of the sacrosanct principles of natural justice. There's a spurious and scandalous allegation. It's a travesty of justice that cannot be countenanced by any court of equity. And
wow.
And I completely understand where they're coming from, because they feel that the language needs to be stronger.
Yeah, they're obviously very upset.
Absolutely. And I get that. And they feel that, if you're just going to say you're wrong or this submission is misconceived, it's not enough. It's not enough to really bring home the point that, they are really, really bad. And so therefore the way to do that for them was, we need to add all this fluff. We need to add as many adjectives that can impress the arbitrator as possible.
There were a lot there. I was thinking when you were reading it that maybe they had their thesaurus open at the time.
Probably, or to be fair, there are lawyers who use those terms. There are judgments with those terms being used. And the challenge for me was how do I explain to
Yeah.
the client that I'm not going to use those phrases? It's not going to be beneficial for their case, because it's on the contrary. If I were the arbitrator and and I read submissions with flowery language and superfluous terms, I would just think, well, perhaps you don't really have a good case. That's why you're trying to.
You're fluffing it up.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Fluffing it up. So I'll pause here and I'll get back a bit later on how I eventually dealt with the client. But how does that? I mean, is that something that resonates in business? Do you sometimes find that clients or businesses find the need to use certain terms and expressions when it doesn't necessarily convey the right message to their audience?
I feel like sometimes people also, they like to use more words or bigger words than are really needed. I've had emails from people before, and it's just so many words and so many big words that, not that I have a struggle to understand them, but I feel like it's almost unnecessary, you know? It could have been said much simpler and in a couple of lines, and the point would have still gotten across. So I think it depends on, I suppose, on the individual.
Do you think, I think it depends on the individual, but also, do you think it could be a cultural difference? In my example of the Indian client, I totally get where they are coming from. I am from an Indian culture. I've grown up watching Bollywood movies. You know, the story, a Bollywood movie would last 3.5 hours. It can be the same story as a Hollywood movie that lasts an hour
all the dancing,
dancing and the singing and all that. But everything is exaggerated. You know, the emotions are exaggerated, and I completely get that. I get the culture. I've been to India many times. I understand, you know, where they're coming from, but also I understand my audience is the South African arbitrator, and
who doesn't have time for all of that flowery language. It just wants it straight and simple.
I'm not sure it's just a matter of time, but also for him, for the arbitrator, that flowery and fluffy language doesn't add much, or actually it could be
take away.
It could take away from the simplicity of the case. So that's why I was asking, do you think it's sometimes to do with cultural differences? And the reason I'm asking this is because in your TEDx talk, you say that communication boils down to two things: understanding and adapting.
Yeah.
And so what do you mean by that?
Look, I think obviously making sure that you actually, before you speak, making sure that you understand what the person is saying to you. I think you always, from when you're young, school teachers are teaching you to listen, you know, and I think a lot of adults forget. I've met so many people, you have a conversation with someone and all they're doing is they're not really listening to you, but they're thinking what they're going to say next, you know, and then it feels very stilted because there's not much flow. So I think very much that understanding comes from listening and listening actively. And then not only that, but obviously making sure that you're understanding who you're speaking to, who you're communicating with, and adapting for your audience. Yeah.
So there's a book, I have to be honest, I haven't read the book, but it's on my list, it's on my reading list. It's called The Culture Map. I don't know if you've heard of it.
I haven't.
It's by Erin Meyer, and it's about how different, how when you speak the same language across different cultures, you've got differences, and the message is not the same. Whether it's the tone that is used or the style in terms of the how direct you're addressing an issue. How language is used for building trust, and the author comes up with this scale of the author comes up with 8 cultural scales. I won't go through all of them. As I've said, I've not read the book, but I have read reviews and summaries, and one of them is high context versus low context. So in some cultures, you you explain things very precisely. You know, you give high context for the conversation. You're giving feedback to an employee or to someone in the business environment. You know, you're giving your comments on a presentation, and you're referring this to this page. On this page, you said that. This is the point you're making, and this is why I disagree with it. And you drill down, you know, into the reasons why you disagree. And then you've got low context, where the person will say, "Yeah, it's a bit vague," or the presentation was good, but I feel like it lacks a bit of analysis regarding the financials. And that's a very broad comment to make. That's why it's called low context. And it's interesting that the author analyzes how your background and culture relates to how you communicate. And for example, she says that in a high context culture, being too direct can feel rude. And whereas in a low context culture, vague messages can be seen as evasive or unprofessional. And it's interesting to understand how your culture and your background relate to the way you communicate.
Absolutely. It's actually a very interesting book. I think I'm going to put it on my list as well. Sounds very interesting. But I think even for me, obviously coming from a South African culture, I think it's very important. And I think I mentioned that in the TEDx talk, is about having that self-awareness.
Yes.
What type of communicator am I? And knowing the pressure points. And I think South Africans, you've probably met loads of them. We can be very much high context, and it can often be seen as incredibly forceful. And we're not actually trying to be rude. We're just trying to get our point across, you know. But we can be very abrupt, and it can be by many cultures seen as rude. And I've said that often to my clients, especially the ones coming from South Africa. I said, just be aware that the way that you speak in South Africa, which is totally accepted because that's the culture you come from, may be construed as rude here. And it's really important to know, I often have to tone down my South Africanness a little bit because I get passionate about things, and then I'm just talking, and then people are like, why are you shouting at me? You know, and I'm like, I'm totally not, you know, but I think it's just knowing how to tone that down.
Of course.
And that just comes from being self-aware. The more you learn about your specific idiosyncrasies, the things in your culture that make you unique. I'm not saying they're bad things, but it's just worth bearing in mind that when you are dealing with other cultures, it might not be seen or perceived the way that you think it is.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And I think that's exactly what the author is getting at in terms of the cultural map. And so as I said, there's 8 cultural scales, and there's the high context versus low context, which I thought was quite interesting and relates. I can relate a lot to that when dealing with clients from different countries. The other one is how trust is developed. And there are certain, in some cultures where trust is developed on the tasks. So it's task-based.
Yes.
And in other cultures, it's relationship-based.
Yeah.
And what the author means by that is you have a client and they want you to do the job. You know, they send you an email, this is what I need. I don't need any conversation with you. I don't need, you know, a phone call to ask how you are and all that. I just need the job to be done.
Yeah.
And that builds the trust. You have clients from other cultures who need to have a conversation with you.
They want to see you on Zoom.
Absolutely.
Or even in person and actually see that you're a real person.
Yeah, and they need to have that relationship built, and then they can ask you about the work. Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting. I never thought about it in that way before I read that summary from the book. But it reminds me, I always joke with colleagues, and that I have certain clients who, every few weeks, every few months, for ongoing matters, they need to send me a message and they need to send me a WhatsApp, or they need to have a quick call. It's never quick when they ask for a quick call, but I'm like, well, there's nothing really going on at the moment. There's no hearing coming up. There's no milestone in the proceedings. But I understand that for them, they need to have that ongoing relationship. Yeah. I have a few clients who would only send a message, "Hi, Bilshan," and there's nothing else to it. But I have learned that's how they communicate. Yeah. They will wait for me to write back, "Hi," and then the next message will be, "How are you?" I've had that exact
thing. That whole trust thing also resonates with me, because often I've had clients who will say, send me an email, "Can you just do this?" And I'll say, "Okay, do you want to have a call?" No need for a call, just do it. And I'm like, okay. And then I've got the others who don't even want to do anything until we've had a conversation and we've had a Zoom call or a Teams call, and they've been able, whether they're here or not, sometimes in person. But I've gotten to the point where I always offer that. So I'll say, look, I'm happy to do a Teams call or a Zoom call. Obviously, a lot of the time they're overseas. And then if they say no, it's fine. And if they want to do it, then I'm happy to do it, because then it puts the ball in their court.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, Candice. And maybe I'll go back to my courtroom story. And I know I left off by telling you what the client wanted me to add. So as I mentioned, I understand the Indian culture. I grew up watching 3.5-hour Bollywood movies. And then if you've been to India and watch Indian TV, the commercials last for 2 to 3 minutes, because the culture very much is to explain everything and to exaggerate the emotions. That's very cultural. Yeah. So, but the problem here was not my style or the client's style. Yeah. It was really what's the message that the arbitrator would read, and it's about conveying the message to the South African arbitrator. And it took me a while to explain to the client. I mean, it was not difficult. We say usually the golden rule in communication is not so much what you say, but it's what the other person hears. Yeah. So I had to jump on a call with the client, and I said, look, I understand where you're coming from, but let me take you line by line through the document and explain what we're saying to the arbitrator, how that's going to be perceived, and let's see whether we can accommodate the suggestions that you've made. In the end, there were a few phrases that wouldn't cause any harm to add, but most of those that I read out earlier were not included, because the client then understood also that they're not being dismissed, but it's not going to be in their interest to have that sort of language in the document that's going to be read by someone from a different culture and who's not necessarily familiar with that style. Is that something that you see every now and then? When you have to make someone from one culture understand how what they're saying might come across to someone from a different culture.
Yeah, I think it's actually critical in my role, because I'm dealing with a lot of people coming from different countries into Mauritius, and so a lot of the time, and obviously when the space allows, I do try and sort of give a few pointers and tips to newcomers coming into Mauritius, and just saying, these are things to watch out for. Watch out for your tone. Watch out for how you speak, the way you do things. If it's South Africans, kind of guiding them to maybe tone it down sometimes. I think what I've noticed here is that a lot of the time in Mauritius, where a South African will approach conflict head on, it doesn't always go down well on the Mauritian side. So when you do have a situation where somebody feels like their service provider has maybe not done what they need to do, there are different ways of dealing with it, you know. And then I think also just understanding the culture you're coming into. I often say to people, just remember it's an island, you know, especially those that are coming from like a fast-paced city type of environment. And I say, you're coming to Mauritius, it's an island. It's a chilled, relaxed lifestyle. And you need to adapt. You need to say, okay, it's a new country. It's a new way of doing things. And I think very important is not trying to change it into what you're expecting, but rather you're the one that adapts. And so I often say to my clients, listen, just bear in mind that it is a different environment, that it's a different culture. And I think just me having lived as an expatriate in Mauritius for so long, I've kind of got an understanding of how things work here and you know, how to deal with Mauritian people and how to speak to them and how to communicate better. So, and I think obviously something that comes with time. At the beginning, you're never going to be great. But just being aware of it and often my clients have said to me, wow, thank you for telling me that. I would never have known. That's not something you find online. Nobody, there's no YouTube video that tells you how to communicate, you know? So a lot of the time they say to me, that's really helpful information actually. And thank you for sharing that. So,
well, hopefully this will be a YouTube video that helps expats or Mauritians to understand people not from here. But no, that's very interesting, and thanks very much for sharing your experience on this subject. Candice, we'll have to come to an end of the episode, and I think I completely agree with what you said in your TEDx talk that communication boils down to two things essentially. It's understanding and adapting, and that works whether you have a conversation between two Mauritians or two South Africans or, you know, people from different cultures, because at the end of the day, you've got cross-cultural differences, but also in an office, in a workspace, in a business meeting, you have people from the same culture, and sometimes you need to adapt and you need to understand where they're coming from and adapt to their communication style. There's one question that I ask every guest on the podcast. It's who inspires you as a good communicator?
So it's a good question. I did have to think a little bit about it. There are actually two people. Both people are people that I follow on LinkedIn. The one is Vanessa Van Edwards, and she has a lot to say about communication and just especially body language and all the unspoken communication, just some great pointers. So if people watching aren't following her, I do highly recommend it. And then the other one I think is Simon Sinek, who also has a lot to say just about communication and just about being heard and being understood. Both are incredible communicators themselves. So I feel like there's a lot we can learn from them. No,
they're brilliant. I also follow both of them. They're brilliant.
That's I can't think of a person I've actually met that I can give you an answer, but those are the two that I'd probably say.
That's very helpful. Thanks very much, Candice. It was a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much, Bilshan. Thank you for having me. Thank you for the chat. I've really enjoyed it.